This is take two. Alright, 3. This is the introduction to social psychology. Regular psychology focuses on the individual and trying to predict and control the behaviors of that individual. Social psychology has much more to do with how the environment, both social and cultural and other things like that, affect the individual and the kind of attributes that a person makes about what's going on around them. Social psychology uses tangible things, that is, things you can measure, intangible things like mental processes that you can't really measure, and transitory, or things that are situational, things that change from time to time. What kinds of things do social psychologists talk about? Things like gender roles. Why are men more aggressive than women? A biological psychologist would probably say it has to do with hormones. A social psychologist might say it has to do with the person's culture or upbringing, their parenting, how people present themselves in public. How do I want you to see me? Now, this is not like pretend. I'm not trying to fake you out. I am trying to enact a role. That is, I might be different at work than I am at home. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm fake. It means that the kinds of priorities that I have at work are not the same that I have at home. There's something called social exchange theory, or what I would call economic interaction. It means a person will perform an action until it becomes quote-unquote too expensive. Let's say that a person is dating. They're dating someone who's very attractive, and that's very meaningful to that person. They want it to be with a person who's very attractive. So when a person is maybe bad to them or expects a lot out of them, then maybe they can say, you know what, I'm willing to quote-unquote pay this price because it's important for me to be with someone who's very attractive. But what about if that attractive person then becomes overly demanding? That's economic interaction. The self-perception theory, which we'll talk about more in class. Experiments. Social psychology does experiments in the laboratory as well as in the field. I think this might go under Mary Ainsworth and the strange situation, which, if you might want to look that up, non-experiments like observation, a naturalistic observation, and a correlation. That is, you think two things go together or they happen close together in time, but there may not be a causative relationship between them. The last one is probably the most famous, which is a self-report. You ask a participant to fill out a questionnaire or a survey, and then you gauge why those things happen based on their self-reported actions. Hello, and welcome to Social Psychology. There's a number of experiments that I would like to talk to very quickly. Computer and dating. In this experiment, they told college-age participants that they would be computer matched with their most compatible mate. In fact, there was no computer involved at all. And what they did was in the experimental group, they matched females with taller male companions. At the end of the night, both the experimental group and control group were asked to fill out a questionnaire about how successful they were matched. In the experimental group, a very high percentage of the females stated that they had a lot in common with their taller males, even though there was no computer matching at all. It was only height. In the second experiment, what they did was had two photographs of the same child. In one photograph, the child was well dressed. In the second photograph, the child was not well dressed in kind of rundown, crummy clothing. One group was shown the good photograph with a discipline record from a school, a fictional school. In the second part, the participants were shown the not well-dressed photograph, but the same discipline record. What they discovered is that with the poorly dressed photograph, participants were asked if the punishment given in the record was appropriate. People shown the quote-unquote bad photograph tended to more often say that the child looked like a troublemaker. With the group where they were given the well-dressed photograph, participants were much more likely to suggest that it was the child's friends that had gotten him in trouble, or that it was peer pressure and perhaps a one-time thing. In the next one about road rage, researchers have shown that road rage incidents increase significantly when the ambient temperature is over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. When asked about why people start to use drugs, I believe it was very high. It was close to 90% of those individuals who started to use illegal drugs or drugs of habit-forming drugs had a family member first or a close friend second who also used that particular drug. This was a rather odd showing in Denmark, where pornography for a while was outlawed, and what they showed was that sex crimes went up after pornography was outlawed. When the ban on pornography was dropped and it was available again, sex crimes went down. The next one about helping behavior had to do with an experiment where there was someone who was made to look like they needed assistance. And there were either a small number of bystanders close by or a very large group of individuals close by. When there were very few people close by to the person in need, the participant was much more likely to take ownership and to stop and to give help or assistance. When the group that was by the person in need was very large, then the individual passing by was much less likely to stop, where the idea being that if there are a lot of people there, well, someone else will help. The last one I want to talk about really quick had to do with General Motors. Apparently, the management structure of General Motors was such that one person might have 3 different bosses. So instead of being able to go to one boss and say, is this work okay, they would sometimes have to go to multiple bosses. And those different upper-level management bosses might not themselves agree on what was acceptable or not. Hence, the idea is that instead of looking for a good product that people might really want to buy, that it came down to what was an acceptable product to the upper-level managers. I would like to talk about some social psychology vocabulary words. The first two have to do with doors. The first one is the foot in the door effect, and the second one is the door in the face effect. Foot in the door comes, well, they both actually come from the days of door-to-door salespeople. With the first one, foot in the door, if you agree to a small promise now, you're more likely to agree to a large promise later on. So if you allow that salesperson in, more than likely you have thought about buying and are more likely to buy. The second one, the door in the face technique or effect, is somebody asks you for something so large that you're surely going to say no. But then they ask you for something much smaller, and believe it or not, you're more likely to say yes. For example, they ask people, would you be willing to take a 2-year position as a counselor for juveniles in a detention facility? Almost everybody said no. It was a very high percent. But then they asked, would you be willing to spend a weekend as a camp counselor for juveniles? And people almost overwhelmingly said yes. Now, social psychology, how does this apply? People want to believe they're good. People want to believe they are giving, they are helpful individuals. So the idea when they say, we want you to work for 2 years, in a juvenile facility, oh, no, I don't want to do that. But that kind of hurts their sort of, the way they see themselves. So the second one kind of gives that person an opportunity to redeem themselves. The next effect that we'll be talking about is called the lowball procedure. And this is something that used car dealerships use. They will say they have one vehicle at this particular very low price, and perhaps it's not a color that you like. Perhaps it doesn't have any options, or maybe the options that you would like are not on it. But you are willing to buy that car because it's at such a good price. But then what happens is when you finally get into the deal, the finance manager will say, oh no, I won't allow that price to go out. Wouldn't you really like that other accessory? And what they do then is they get you to buy more than you had really wanted to at the first part. You would think a lot of people would not do that they would say, no, this is the price I want and you can't give it to me, I'll go someplace else. But in fact, many people will stay simply because they don't like buying vehicles. They don't like the stress of buying a vehicle, and so will go ahead and buy a more expensive vehicle than they had intended. Locus of control, which is our next one, has to do with, quote-unquote, where the power is. Do you feel it inside of yourself, or is it outside of yourself? Inside, internal locus of control means I feel powerful. I can control things that happen in my life. So if you don't do well on a test, you will say, I didn't study very well. Someone with internal locus of control says, I make things happen, not things happen to me, because that's the external locus control, where people say, I don't have any control over my life. It's all up to fate. Nothing that I can do will change the future. The last one I wanted to talk about is learned helplessness. This is where a person tries something and they don't do very well. Not that they totally fail, but they don't do very well. They try it again and they don't do very well. It's not that they totally fail, but for some reason they're just not doing very well. Eventually, when they come up to that scenario or that particular thing, they will just throw up their hands and say, I can't do it. Instead of pushing themselves to try harder where they might actually succeed, or to try something completely different. These are some of the more famous experiments in social psychology. The first one, on conformity, had a group of people who were in on the experiment and one participant within that group who was not in on the experiment. They were asked in one particular case to judge the length of a line segment. The group was told to pick the wrong one. So the individual participant is trying to pick the correct one, but the group is saying, no, that's not it. You would think then that the individual would continue to pick the one that they believe is correct, but that is not the case. I believe it was the first 1 or 2 times the person would pick the correct answer, but after that would agree with the group. In the second experiment on obedience, which is maybe more well known, there was a learner who was going to be memorizing word associations. If the learner got the association incorrect, they were to be shocked in increasing amounts over the time of the experiment. What should have happened, because it got into an area where it said electrical shock dangerous, what should have happened is that people should have realized they were hurting this individual and stopped. But because there was a person in a lab coat who suggested that they would take responsibility, many of the individuals did not stop. In fact, I think it was more than 65 or 68% went all the way to where they would have shocked the person to death. Urban overload, really quick, is why is it that people in large cities are sometimes not as helpful, even if they see something bad happening, as someone who might be in the country or a more rural area? And Milgram stated that he felt that urban areas were so flush with stimuli that people could just not cope with everything that they were seeing, hearing, feeling. And so in order to cut down on that amount of stimuli, they sometimes would block out bad things that were happening and ignore them. The last one, Bandura and the Bobo doll experiment. In this one, violent television programs were played for children with the idea of, if this violent programming makes children violent, then we'll be able to see. In another experiment, in a different room, what they had is violent TV, but they also had a doll in which, during a certain violent portion of the program, an adult would come in and then bash this doll in, so to speak, like beat up the doll, and then leave. It turns out that children were much more susceptible to violence when they saw the adult come in and abuse the doll first. Hello, this is a quick addendum. I was editing and realized that I forgot two experiments that I really wanted to talk about. One experiment had to do with job and attitudes about their job. The other one had to do with college students. The one about the job that I wanted to talk about was that people's attitudes about their job were predicated upon the position that they held. That is, one person went from a line job in a manufacturing plant to working as a steward, that is, someone with a union. Their attitudes about union versus management changed when they became a union steward. The researcher came back like 8 or 12 months later. Some of those people who had moved into administrative jobs had lost those positions, either due to time or because they just weren't good at it. In fact, when they moved back to their old job, their attitude changed again about management and worker. The other one was about college students. First-year college students, much like first-year high school students, sometimes don't take their studies very seriously. Some of those college students were very concerned. These would be individuals who did not have a 3.0. They were below a 3.0. Those groups of freshman students in college who did not have a 3.0 were some were shown a video of juniors and seniors in college talking about how their first year grades were not maybe so great either, but that they went on to be very high scoring individuals. What they found was that for those individuals who got the inspirational video, the inspirational talk, for males the intervention was very high. Those who saw the video had much better grades later on after that. What was interesting, however, was that the increase was not as strong for women. The odd thing about that is that women in both groups, the experimental group and the control group, both had their grades rise. Well, which that means out of the four groups, men who didn't see it, men who did, women who did see it, and women who didn't, that only the group of men who did not see the instructional video or the inspirational video did not do very well. Everybody else did well. So